I'm going to take you on a journey today. It'd actually be a lot better if somebody gave me the clicker to be able to take you along this journey. Briefly, a few words about Ksubaka. So we're a tech and data platform, and we use the language of games to engage consumers and drive insights. And we're doing this in offline environments and really bridging the offline and online worlds. But today, I'm actually going to tell you about a whole bunch of other ways that brands are using this, and we're going to explore how games can actually participate in even making this a better world. And it really starts with the brain. What are the core motivations that we have in things that we're doing? The challenge, things like scarcity, how all of these elements that are really built into every single type of game are also essential to what we're doing and the choices that we are making as consumers. Fundamentally, one of the key things behind all of this is this notion of choices. As consumers, we are making some 35,000 choices a day. 35,000. Of course, just about all of these choices are completely in the background. We're not actually consciously making these choices. We consciously make around 50 decisions a day, right? But there's a whole bunch of things, of inputs that we are taking from the outside world, and those are driving unconscious decisions or remotely conscious decisions that we're making. Think of it as a difference between you deciding to attend today this conference and where you decided to sit in the room. And one of the things that's fascinating when we start looking at what gaming is doing is that gaming is expert at understanding and at driving some of these key choices. And so, unsurprisingly, the gaming market that really understands this funnel has grown into a massive market. I think most of you guys are aware that the gaming market is big. You're probably not aware of quite how big it is. We're talking about something that is over 3 times the size of the entire movie industry. And that means that you have around 2.2 billion people who are playing games every year. Of course, that means that everybody's playing games. Demographics for games are not your sub-18-year-olds. In fact, average is 35 years old. If we look on mobile, it is primarily female. Well, not primarily, but more females than males. So we know that everyone is, and they're playing it on their phones, and they're playing it on different types of devices. One of the key interesting things that we start to look at is what are the different motivations behind all of these players. And this is really where we start understanding and unlocking how these tools can be used for engaging millennials in a way that is relevant. Bartle came up with one of the first separation of player types. And really what he was mapping out is seeing how you have some key motivators in the different types of players. So you have your achievers, who are all about completing the experience, getting through every single level, every single badge. You have the explorers, who are interested in the world. They just want to make sure that they see every single corner of what that world is about. The socializers, obviously, are about the clans, the groups that they're with, and about sharing those elements with their friends. And finally, the killers, well, the killers are all about dominating. And nobody is just one player type. People have different levels of attributes across all of these. The art of using this and understanding who these player types are is one of the key elements in using the language of games to drive incredibly powerful marketing and insights. But there's a whole bunch of other elements that come into it. And to do it well, it isn't about saying, I'm going to do a leaderboard, and hey, now my experience is gamified. You have things like learning, you have progression, you have the flow, timing, unlockables. All of these elements need to be brought together. And this, I guess, perfectly for this location where we are today, this mix of arts and science is really at the heart of a great gamified experience. And the science part we'll talk about, because it is at the end of the day about how you are looking at the outcomes and understanding every single step of the funnel. So I'm going to show you a few examples now of how this can be used to actually do some really cool and good stuff. This is an experience that was done in Stockholm, where they decided to create a lottery where all of the people who would get to participate in this lottery do so by driving under the speed limit. You're automatically entered if you're driving under the speed limit. And all those who drive above the speed limit will, their fines become the prizes for everyone who is going under. And this immediately reduced traffic violations by 22%. And just a way where you are building in some of these simple game mechanics and affecting people's behaviors in incredibly positive ways, in a way that all of the other previous campaigns they had done of just saying, slow down, it's dangerous, did not work. I'll show you one of my favorite ones, and this is really something that inspired me at the start of Ksubaka. And this was a microloan company that did this in Africa, and the idea was that you could donate your small change to make big changes. And so these interactive billboards, you could basically message to this interactive billboard, and you would see virtually in your pennies that would create this portrait of women, and this would fund them for whatever their venture was. Incredibly successful, incredibly delightful, getting immediately this sense of reward and delight as you are doing something good. There's one example that you may have been aware of, and again, back to Stockholm. And this is something that was done in the subway in Stockholm, where they wanted to see if they could get people to stop using the elevator and go up the stairs. And they used very simple gamification mechanics in order to create this feedback loop that would be delightful for the people that were there. It's better if there's sound, but you get the idea. You have a piano that is there. I guess you guys don't have the sound. There you go. And so as people were going up and down these stairs, they started having this playful experience, and 66% more people decided to go up the stairs instead of the elevator. So what we notice on a lot of these experiential elements that are bringing in elements of gamification is that they tend to be one-offs. Very few of these things actually scale. And there's one case study that I want to share with you because it is remarkable and in a country that does scale better than anywhere else, and it's in China. Right now what you're looking at is a very young forest of some 10 million trees that have been planted in Inner Mongolia. These trees have been planted by Alibaba, and they've been planted because people have done activities on Alipay that have led to that. They created within Alipay I don't know if you guys use Alipay or have it, but basically you have a whole series of icons on your page. If you go to a secondary page, you have even more icons. They just simply put an icon there for ant forest. And ant forest was just saying, start growing your virtual tree. And start sharing with your friends what you are doing and how your tree is growing. And you know what? We're going to build in this thing where you can start stealing energy points from your friends to grow the tree faster. But really, what they want you to do is start generating more and more of these energy points. And you do that by doing activities that are interesting and relevant for Alipay. So if you walk instead of taking your car, well, you're doing good for the planet. But more interesting for Alipay is if you use OFO, which is the bike sharing one that Alibaba invested into instead of Mobike. Well, if you use OFO, you get even more energy points. If you go cashless, well, now you are not using paper and you are doing good for the planet, and that also gives you energy points. And really, they start guiding you through all of the types of activities where you can start using Alipay and encouraging you to use more and more of them to grow your tree ever faster. This was incredibly successful. it's incredibly successful in the sense that there was this desire that you get to the point where you have your fully grown tree, which takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And if you do that, you then get your certificate of that tree and you see where it is planted. And this resulted in 230 million users, over 10 million trees that have been planted to date, and obviously a great impact on the planet. This is a really incredible achievement. It is also incredibly rare. And really, we're here at Millennial 2020 and trying to understand how these tools can be used to engage consumers and how brands can use it. And the sad truth for brands is that consumers do not care about them remotely as much as the brands hope that they do. The idea of loyalty around brands is vastly overemphasized, and this was made particularly clear in Byron Sharp's How Brands Grow. In fact, one of the famous examples is that Coke drinkers, 72% of the time, will also buy Pepsi. The highest predictor of what type of product you will buy is actually that you're just buying in the category and you will buy based on market share. So the engagement issue we can see is a fundamental issue for the biggest marketers in this world. Nobody has been more outspoken about this than Mark Pritchard, the chief brand officer of P&G. And Mark Pritchard is saying we have a problem in digital, which is 75% of all of the money that we spend is wasted. It's generally not even reaching customers due to bots or ad fraud or ad blockers, and we have a tougher time engaging them. The one thing that he's been talking about recently is the amount of time that people engage. Of all of the things that P&G does, the average digital engagement time that they get is 1.7 seconds, right? So it's very hard to get people involved in brand equity in that amount of time. So obviously one of the ways that you think that you can get people super engaged is that you start creating your own apps. However, 0.01% of all apps in the world ever get more than 50,000 users. And if you are an FMCG company and you're selling billions of things, that doesn't really get you very far. It costs around $3, $3.20 to get a user on mobile, and your reopen rates are incredibly low. And yet, this is fundamental for these brands. They need to find a way to engage. And why? Because the emotional brain is one of the key predictors of how you will purchase. In fact, if you measure an advertising and the reactions of the emotional brain to that advertising, that offers you the best correlation as to the effectiveness that your advertising will have. And therefore, you want to create this engagement because once you get somebody engaged, it changes the dynamic. One of the things that we can see is an example that Dan Ariely, the famous behavioral economist, talks about. I don't know if you guys have seen his TED Talks. They're brilliant. And Dan Ariely takes the example of origamis, which is if somebody shows you an origami, it has little value, unless it's in Blade Runner, maybe a little bit more value. If, however, you make the origami yourself, well, then your perception of the value of that origami is incredibly higher. And you actually perceive that the rest of the world should see that also as higher value. And this is why if you can get somebody engaged, you start having a feeling of ownership, and that engagement then leads to better outcomes. You can think of it as things that we do every day. You're building an IKEA Malm or Pax. I guess we all learn these weird Swedish names because we've all at some point or another spent hours doing these. And it's almost gamified in terms of how you're building out those IKEA shelvings. And you know what? At the end of the day, you have some pride around it. Like all games, however, it needs to be carefully balanced, because if you do it wrong, well then what you have is incredibly frustrated and angry people. So I mentioned Byron Sharp earlier, and Byron Sharp has 7 rules as to what are the things that really make a difference for brands. I'm going to highlight the 3 most important ones for you. One is about this notion of always on. And then there's a notion around how you are creating distinctive brand assets. But the one that I'm most focused on right here is this idea of refreshing and rebuilding memory structures, because there is nothing that games do better than enabling you to refresh and rebuild memory structures. One of the most powerful tools to achieve that is this idea of fun that I showed you at the beginning. Because what fun does, it releases dopamine. And dopamine is this unbelievably feel-good hormone which really associates this feeling of reward with an action that you have taken, and the way that you remember that moment and that event are radically different because you actually got involved, you had that sense of ownership, and you got that positive feedback from it. So how have brands actually used this? Well, there's some great examples, and there's some brands who really get this idea of delivering some joyful moments that engage. There was an example done here in Singapore where you would hug a Coke machine, and if you hug the Coke machine, it would deliver that Coke, and then you got other people to participate. A super fun case study that you can find on YouTube. Another example, and definitely Stockholm being the capital of the world of all of these types of engagements, back to them again, where you had the billboard reacting as the train came in and the hair of the woman moved around, and it just created this surprise and engagement of people around. One of the great ways to think about how you create powerful engagements is to go back to things that you know really tap into your curiosity on an everyday basis. Think of yourself in the streets of New York, and you'll see somebody shuffling cups, right? This is something that, if ever you have walked on Times Square or around, it's very hard to take your eyes away. It's like, oh, I'm going to follow this cup, and I'm going to figure it out. The way that Ksubaka does it through our play spots that we deploy, manage in stores, is using this language of games in a way that creates the same sense of delight and reward. And here's something that we've done for Nescafe, where you are getting the intrinsic experience around preparing your cup of coffee. And this very simple mix and match, but your eyes are now tracking. And you laugh as you're like, okay, it's easy, I can get it. And I carry on engaging around that. And you create something that lasts around 60 seconds, as opposed to those 1.7 seconds that Mark Pritchard from P&G was talking about, and something that resonates deeply with you because you actually had this participation moment around it. And these things can be done at scale because every new store is a new audience. We are currently deployed in 130 cities in China. We have 8,000 of these displays that engage some 15 million people a month, 15 million shoppers. And here is something that we did for Mondelez in China. They were launching Milka, which is one of the largest launches they've ever done anywhere in the world. And they had zero awareness in China. They were coming into a complex chocolate market. The promise of Milka is about tenderness inside. And when you are trying to cover a media market as vast and as expensive as China, it's very hard to tell in 15 seconds a story that can really deliver on that promise of tenderness. We created for them an experience where you actually had to have your hands interlocked, and you combine your two hands together and hold them to create the Milka bar, and that would unlock the success in the game. And we had 12.4 million people in the space of a month participate around this experience, spending on average 90 seconds engaging around this brand and radically transforming their feeling of ownership around Milka and their sense of reward around engaging around this. The most important thing behind all this game is not just this idea of how we are creating this fun and delightful engagement, but also how you optimize it. And the real power of games is that games, before anything else, are data. And data drives every single element. The reason why you see a company like Tencent that in the space of 10 years went from zero revenue in gaming to a majority of their revenue in gaming today is because these people understand data. And what you are measuring is not just a click, the way that you do it online, but all of the mini choices that we talked about at the beginning in between. So here's an example, again, something that we did for Pepsi in Australia. And what we're actually doing is that you have a very basic, simple game here, so a memory card matching type game. And if somebody plays it once, it tells you nothing. It just gives you the information that somebody spent a minute engaging with that brand, and it created uplift and good feelings.
But if you start looking at this over 1 million people that are playing, and again, we have 15 million people a month that engage on these experiences, well, what you start measuring is the reaction time, the element recognition, and the prioritization between these various elements. And you start seeing that you have errors of matching rates between certain packaging elements versus others. And that informs you in terms of to the recognizability of certain packaging elements, right? So you are driving insights throughout the actions and the choices that people are making. So our company is very much a data company, although the front end and what you'll be able to see if you go to the third floor is all of these fun experiences. But the intelligence behind the system of where to deploy the right application at the right moment and how you optimize those experiences is just a data game. On our level, those 8,000 screens that I mentioned generate around 1.3 billion structured data points every month. And this informs us on a way of creating ever more delightful experiences and ones that engage ever more. And if you see one of our displays, you might think, oh, it's like a kiosk, and like most kiosks in store, over time, everybody stops engaging and it becomes boring. Actually, through data, what we see is that we double the number of engagements on a location over a year, and we have 75 to 100 engagements every day on each of our displays. And this is because our platform drives data in very sophisticated ways where we enable brands and retailers to deploy a Ksubaka network where we provide them all of the tools and a suite of back-end tools and front-end pre-built gamified experiences where they can start creating their own engagements that are this effective in store. So I'm going to leave you with a last thought, and so like that we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. And this is a quote from Albert Einstein. Play is the highest form of research. So the explorers amongst you, I guess, will now get on your phones and start to figure out if this is one of the rare quotes of Einstein that you find online that was actually said by him or not. The socializers amongst you are really going to start spreading the word, and you can do that at hashtag M2020 and at Ksubaka in terms of this is a new form of marketing that really deserves to be explored and implemented on a much bigger scale because one can see the effectiveness of this like few other marketing initiatives enable. And the killers and what are the other ones that I forgot? We have the socializers, the killers. Anybody was following? We have the explorers, the socializers, the killers, and the achievers. The achievers amongst you will really go out and start implementing this and creating a new path for creating better forms of engagements with the millennial consumer of today. Thank you very much.